Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Brexit, for the first time, the Cabinet are meeting as we speak to create, I suppose, a vision for what leaving the European Union looks like. Finally, we'll start to hear what their vision is, if they have a vision. And at the same time as this, I mean, Lord knows there are going to be disagreements at that table, but at the same time as that meeting happens, the IPPR, the Institute for Public Policy Research think tank, says that it's possible to leave the European Union, honour the referendum result, and actually have not very much change at all. It's suggesting that the UK and the EU could essentially share each other's markets. The UK and the EU continuing to have the kind of alignment that exists today, and then slowly over time diverge away from that, allowing tariff-free trade and the UK to benefit from EU trade deals as well. Is that your end game? We There are big differences around the cabinet table when it comes to the Brexit endgame. For example, you have the likes of the Chancellor and the Home Secretary who would probably, based on what they've said so far, want the UK to stick rather closely to the EU's single market to preserve access for British industry, British firms. But on the other hand, you have the likes of Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, Michael Gove, wanting more of the D word, divergence, so that the UK has more freedom and immediate freedom to strike its own trade deals with other countries once we leave. I wonder how you feel, though, about that IPPR idea, the idea that we can wait before we diverge, can have essentially something like the status quo, a separate customs union, but one that mirrors pretty much the one we already have. So you could honour, I mean, I think it may be Pollyanna-ish of them, perhaps not, we'll find out all in good time, but is it too far? Is it a compromise, a stretch too far to suggest that we could leave the single market, leave the customs union, and yet for some years after we do that, have real alignment with the European Union, real convergence still with them? They claim this is possible whilst honouring the referendum result without changing very much at all. We'll find out in due course what the end game of the Cabinet is. But does that IPPR proposal, suggestion, feel anything like your end game? 0345 6060 973, the number to call. You can text 84850 or tweet at LBC. Earlier on, I spoke to Sam Coates, the Deputy Political Editor for The Times, and I asked him, with our own Christmas dinners fast emerging and the kind of stresses and strains and prickly conversations that can happen at the dinner table on Christmas Day with our in-laws and the like, whether the table in the Cabinet Office will be particularly prickly today.
Well, just like your dinner table, I think if Brexit gets brought up, things get difficult. That's just the way it is at the moment. Look, I think that we've known and built up for quite a long time this question about what the Cabinet are going to do when they have to finally decide amongst themselves the kind of vision that they want Britain after Brexit. What sort of country should we be? What kind of relationship do we want with the EU that we've just left? What do we want to do differently? What do we not want to do the same? I mean, it's worth just pausing for a second to consider how incredible it is that here we are 17 months after Brexit, and really there hasn't been any kind of sense of leadership about where Theresa May wants to take the country, apart from leaving the customs union single market, but not much of a vision in its place. We haven't heard from cabinet members what they want, and there hasn't really been a national conversation. And the reason is the same reason that this conversation is expected to be quite difficult, because there are stark choices and people take different views. So, for instance, you've got people like the Chancellor who think that most of our trade will continue to be done with the European Union, our closest neighbours, and it's important not to to become a completely different type of economy, making it so much harder for us to trade with them. And then you've got people like Liam Fox and Boris Johnson who see Britain's role in the world being not just as an adjunct to the EU, but being able to forge new kinds of relationships with America, with South Korea, with Canada, having less of what they see as the inhibiting rules of the EU imposed on British manufacturing goods and the way that we do things, and on the economy in general, and just try and be a bit more of a sort of light touch regulatory regime that helps growth to explode. I mean, underlying that's quite an interesting point. The kind of questions being asked now are very much along the kind of left-right lines that involve many of the things that for years were part, because we remember the European Union, so didn't have to make them ourselves. Suddenly, questions which we allowed other people to take the decisions on are now surfacing again. So it's not surprising that some of them are quite difficult.
But it feels to me as well, I wonder whether you agree, it feels to me as well like another one of those moments since the referendum where you wish this kind of thing had been thrashed out during the campaign in more detail.
Yeah. Yes, I do. I understand how that. Why it didn't happen in the campaign. It was in the side's interest to go into some of this stuff. But yes, in fact, let me put it another way. The thing that I regret more than that is that we haven't used the time since the referendum efficiently enough, effectively enough to have this conversation ourselves. Theresa May has decided not to particularly ask questions of the public that the cabinet are now having to decide. She doesn't really want this conversation, it would appear, to be taken in public. I think if there was a fault, I would probably lean more towards saying that was the problem. Once we knew the decision had been made, we needed to make all those other decisions off the back of it, and that just hasn't been discussed very much, rather than the problem that we didn't discuss it before the referendum.
And just a word on what the IPPR has said today, this think tank, saying that it can see a scenario where the EU and the UK could essentially, to start with anyway, for some years after Brexit, share each other's markets. So see no dramatic change from how the single market works. It be in a different customs union or another customs union in which they do business that looks remarkably like the existing customs union. The IPPR seems to be suggesting that this could be a way of honouring the referendum whilst actually changing very little, but allowing down the line for that free trade that you talk about elsewhere in the world.
Whilst I'm not completely sure that the IPPR's exact solutions will be implemented, particularly if Theresa May remains in government, I do think that the spirit of what they're talking about is actually quite a likely outcome. And look about it narrowly, and I know this is a narrow prism through which to look at things, but this is the way the cabinet will see it. Look at it through the prism of Tory politics and Tory ambition. We will finish with the transition phase in 2021. That's the moment where we could burst out and become a completely different country. But the danger from Theresa May and Philip Hammond and Boris Johnson's point of view is that we embark on massive change just, 15 months before a general election, and that will carry with it huge risks of everything going wrong. I would expect the cabinet to end up agreeing something of a fudge that will say, look, of course we will now have the freedom to do whatever we want. We're not going to exercise it immediately at the start. We're going to wait for Europe to make some decisions and maybe disagree with them and let them go off in another direction, leaving us behind. But we're not going to dramatically change our approach to competition between businesses, to whether or not the government starts giving companies large lumps of money, to what we do with our taxation system. We're not going to do all that in 2021 just because we can, but we like the idea that we can, but we'll defer those decisions to after subsequent elections when there's a bigger mandate for actual change rather than just the process of being allowed to make these.
I suppose, given that the divorce analogy has been used so often, it's a bit like saying, I won't remarry until everything has settled down after the divorce.
I think you're still working out the maintenance payments and the schedule of seeing the kids. Okay. I don't think there's any remarriage involved. We will be, as the EU would call, a third party, as a divorcee might call it, firmly in the other house.
That was Sam Coates, Deputy Political Editor for the Times newspaper. I mean, he's probably right, isn't he, when he says there's inevitably going to be, just within the Conservative Party, if you think about what the various groups that Theresa May has to please inside and outside the government, that it will inevitably involve compromise. Inevitably it will. But is this IPPR idea, does it appeal to you in any way? A shared market, including agriculture, fisheries, customs union, eliminating the need for customs and compliance checks that exist between EEA countries and the EU, European Economic Area countries and the EU. They say it is much more ambitious than that kind of arrangement to enter the EEA. Is it an end game that you could live with? 0345 6060 973, honouring the referendum result without really changing very much at all. 84850 is the text. You can tweet at LBC. Liam has called from Liverpool on this. How do you regard that particular proposal, Liam?
Well, there's a couple of aspects. The first one is I love this Remain angle of clinging on to everything that's EU, even though we voted to leave. And your paraphrasing there is absolutely classic of the Remain, of where people just have not accepted the results of the referendum, despite the fact that numerous people have been quoted and rerun, and tapes have shown where Cameron and Osborne and everybody else said voting leave meant leaving the single market, and it meant leaving the customs union. And you guys just cannot accept that fact.
I can and I do,
Liam.
Liam.
Let me just finish. The
All
IPPR
right.
have come out today with what you just mentioned there. It's so what? So what if they come out with it? What have we seen in the last 48 hours? We've seen Michel Barnier come out and with his comments and quotes as to what it is and what he expects and what he sees, and almost to the point of we've just got this agreement last week, and now the next little tranche of sort of like threats are coming across from the other side. And the fact is, it doesn't make any difference what this think tank says. It's absolute nonsense, if you ask me. And it does, whether or not people can agree or disagree, well, obviously that's the choice. The bottom line is that it doesn't really make one iota of difference, because the EU will do what the EU wants. And unfortunately, May and Hammond are just backing us into this Remain Brexit, whatever however you can paraphrase that. It's just pathetic.
But Theresa May repeatedly said, and just for the record, I do accept the referendum result. I don't like it, but I do accept it. But that was just the referendum result. It was not the detail of how we leave. It was the fact of leaving. And you know that that's the case, Liam. You know that there's still a lot to discuss.
It's very simple.
It's not.
It is very simple.
It's not simple.
Very, very. Well, if you let me tell you what's simple, I'll tell you exactly what's simple. I would say that nearly every person who voted leave knew that they were voting because they were voting to leave the single market and the customs union. So that bit we cannot, despite your Jameses and all the rest of the people on your shows who all on the Remain, tried time and time again to bring this around.
No, but that doesn't mean that. No, I don't disagree with what you've said, but that doesn't mean that process is simple, and it doesn't mean, let me finish, it doesn't mean that process does not still require some rational debate and investigation.
There is rational debate, you're absolutely right, and the rational debate is, and you probably cut the call now, is the rational debate is it's all about money. It's all about what Juncker and Co can get for what they need to get, and that's it. And this next set of discussions will go exactly the same way as the last one. We'll have all the discussions to say nothing's changing, May needs to do more, and we're going to get to the 11th hour, just like we did last week, where we were 48 hours away.
A rollover.
Straight the way through to the 11th hour, because that's exactly what the EU
And do you regard that first stage agreement as a rollover or a success?
I'm sceptical, to be honest with you. I'm not a person who necessarily thinks that we just close up the shop, pull up the borders and say, right, that's it, we'll segregate ourselves off. However, neither do I feel that, and I do feel that we're in an exceptionally strong negotiating position. And the thing I liked about Barnier was nothing is agreed till everything's agreed. So when David Davis came out and said, well, it's a gentleman's agreement, it's nothing illegal, and then Guy Verhofstadt did his usual ramping up...
Let's legalise this as soon as possible, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, and all that. And basically, so I play on the... I hope the governments haven't got the backbone of the jellyfish. I hope they've got a little bit more in them to basically say, well, I tell you what, we'll turn table. Nothing is agreed till everything is agreed.
So your end game...
35 billion. Sorry?
Your end game, then, is the same as it was on the day you voted to leave. Leave the single market, leave the customs union, come what may.
You tell me where that's a free trade association.
Tell me what's a free trade association. The IPPR suggestion.
Well, we're paying. There's nothing free about dealing with Europe. It's costing us $10 billion a year. There's nothing free. South Korea, the 11th largest country.
Well, they deal with us and pay in as well.
The 11th largest, South Korea, as an example, they don't pay anything to do with the EU, do they? That's what you call a free trade association.
So your end game is what? Just buy, see ya?
No, I've just said that to you before. My end game is a negotiation, but we have a very, very strong... I'm more of a... You ask me where I fall, I probably fall down on where, let's say, Mogster falls down. Jacob, I kind of... Yes, let's keep the talks going, but hang on a minute. Let's be sensible about this, and let's put some proper red lines in there, and let's make sure... I don't agree with the European Court of
Justice.
ECJ. I don't believe having that in the UK. I'm sorry, that's what I voted for. I want our laws stopping at the Supreme Court. I don't want any judge in Belgium or anywhere else in Strasbourg telling our courts what we can do in our country, and that's another reason why I voted out. But that doesn't mean that we can't. I put it, one of my things is I absolutely love Europe. I find myself loving all these other countries, and this is the thing that makes me laugh, is that, I'm sitting here reading this morning about the 5-star movement. That'll certainly put the cat amongst the pigeons in March if they get in, won't it?
It certainly will. Liam, thank you for your call. Liam in Liverpool. That suggestion from the IPPR to propose to create a shared market for the EU and the UK, something that honours the referendum, because we do leave the single market, we do leave the customs union. Theresa May has made it clear how she sees our involvement with the ECJ going. Hasn't satisfied everybody, but there you go. It's so far that's where we're at, having a small association with it still for 7 or 8 years after Brexit. But what compromise is your compromise? Is your end game just a simple leave? Or do you accept? Liam began by sounding like he didn't accept, but ended up speaking like a man who did accept that there does need to be compromise. There is still time for detail. It really isn't that simple. What's your end game? The Cabinet trying to work out theirs today. What's your Brexit end game? The Cabinet is meeting today for the first time to discuss in earnest what their end vision, their end game for Brexit is. There will be, we know there are big differences around that table, but there are big differences around every table in the country, it seems to me, not least when I speak to you. We have big differences, don't we, over what we think the Brexit endgame should be. Jed in Crewe says, my endgame is Brexit. You really do not get it. Mr. Barnier says we have to feel the pain of leaving. So be it, says Jed. Chris says, EU rules restrict manufacturing. Is that why manufacturers are desperate to stay in the single market and want to retain standards and a single set of rules? So my guess from that tweet is that Chris thinks this IPPR proposal of having a shared market with the European Union, a new customs union separate to the one that we're currently in, it could be the right kind of compromise. What the actual IPPR says is that this is a proposal not for the 15% of what they call extremists on either side. Do you regard yourself as an extremist? It is a proposal for the 70% of people who want a sensible deal built on precedents that would work for the whole country. Reasonable, or an end game too far for you? 0345 6060 973. Is it the worst kind of fudge? 84850, the number to text. You can tweet at LBC. I have so many problems with this idea, says Incorrigible FCA on Twitter. But the overriding one is that the EU simply will not countenance an a la carte post-Brexit trade deal. It would be an open invitation to the EU 27 to each demand their own perceived best bits, a non-starter, says Incorrigible. Michael's call from Barking on this. Is it a non-starter? A non-starter?
Yes, it's a non-starter as well.
Go on, why?
Well, I believe we're not leaving. I believe they will have another referendum, and I believe they will make sure that the people who couldn't vote in 2016 will become of age, and they'll have another referendum in 2019 and the younger people will vote to stay.
And it was interesting to hear Diane Abbott over the weekend saying that Labour is not in favour of a second referendum.
They're not in favour, but it doesn't mean to say they won't have one. I mean, look, we're still allowing everything that happens now, even though we're supposed to be leaving. People are still coming into the country. They're still sleeping on their streets. They're still begging on their streets. And apparently we're not allowed to send them back.
Do you want to leave?
Yes, I voted leave. Because, I mean, I believe that people, migrants come here and work, they work long hours, and they do, a lot of them, and they pay tax. But there's also the ones that don't come here to work. They come here to look for benefits, they look for freebies, they're begging on our streets, they're sleeping on our streets. And they should deport all those people, but apparently we can't do that. It's not PC, is it?
So how do you feel when, I mean, I'm guessing just by the views you've expressed just now and what your take, that you fall into the 15% that the IPPR has described as extremists?
Yes.
On either side?
Well, if people come here to work, I mean, like if someone got a job at LBC and they didn't do anything, but they got paid more than you wouldn't appreciate that, would you?
I would not, Michael.
Exactly.
I'd have their guts for garters.
Yeah, but people are coming here, they've paid no tax, they don't work, they're claiming benefits, and they're sending the benefit money back to their own country to renovate their own homes.
You've seen that, have you?
That was on TV.
Which TV?
And he said, the guy said, I only want another £3,000, and thank you, England. And they filmed him doing it.
So there's no compromise that would satisfy you. Can you think of any compromise that would satisfy you?
Allow the people that come here who work and pay tax to live here. But the ones who are just taking the pay, send them back.
All right, Michael in Barking, thank you. Nathaniel in Bromley, hello there.
Hi. I've just got a few comments. Regarding your last caller, why don't we just start with tackling the tax issues and the benefit problems that we have as a country? There's so many people here who are able to work, who choose not to work, and they just claim benefits. I don't think we can completely blame immigrants on the benefit problems in this country.
We can't, although our employment rates are at the highest they've been in 40 odd years, 45 years, although there's a bit of a dip in employment in the last set of figures, but they're improving all the time.
Yeah, and that's possibly because of the skill shortage in this country, where we're effectively importing workers to do the jobs that we can't currently do. Especially if you look at the NHS, for example, the majority of, not the majority, but there's a large number of nurses that come from the European Union because we just don't have enough nurses here. And not only do we not have enough nurses, the incentive to go and study nursing has been considerably brought down because of the change in the tuition fees and the lack of bursaries and support. So,
but Nathaniel, what I can't link two of the things you've just said there. What I can't knit together is your initial claim that there are lots of lazy, work and tax shy people in this country, and that what they're really all sitting at home waiting for is the opportunity to train to be a nurse.
No, what I'm trying to say is that we here at this country, we like to blame a lot of external factors instead of looking in the mirror, as in what can we do to better off the country? Because I'm not saying that we don't have the potential to do great things. It's just that we say, someone else can do it. And when it came to a previous caller, he said that something about, what did he say? He said that he voted leave because we decided that we don't want to be a part of the customs union, etc. I don't believe a lot of people were aware of those things, because
they may have been aware. They may have heard politicians like David Cameron and others say that, but they wouldn't have had a baldy clue, some of them, what a customs union was.
Exactly, because Michael Farage, he kept talking about how much we pay into the EU budget and the number of immigrants, etc. He didn't say the consequences of us actually leaving the EU. And I'm a 22-year-old who studies economics, and from what I see and what's happened so far, the future isn't that great in the immediate for us.
Well, I hope you're wrong. Thank you, Nathaniel, for your call. Nathaniel in Bromley. Theresa May and her senior ministers, the Cabinet, formally discussing for the first time what the UK's long-term relationship with the EU should be. Long-term now, I'm talking, not just between now and March 2019. What's your Brexit endgame? 0345 6060 973, the number to call. You can text 84850 or tweet at LBC. The time is 1:31. We are told the Cabinet are meeting to discuss their endgame, their vision for how we should leave the European Union, what Brexit should ultimately mean and ultimately look like. We know that debate is ongoing, probably in every house, let alone just number 10. You've been telling me what your endgame is for Brexit. It's not down to MPs, it's down to the people. We voted out Mrs May's weak, no backbone, all about money, not about people, says Keith. Bicycle Repairman on Twitter says, if nothing changes, how is it honouring the referendum result? I think that's a good question, because my feeling is that what the IPPR is suggesting is something of sort of technical change rather than the real spirit of leaving the European Union. And what's lacking from it, and this is a good thing or a bad thing depending on your view, what's lacking in their suggestion is any nod to the emotional factor in that vote to leave the European Union. It was ignored throughout the campaign, and it's been ignored ever since, it seems to me, in terms of how people assess what comes next. I mean, there is a massive emotional desire to leave the European Union that's based not on the economics of it, but entirely on the emotion of it. You could argue that that is foolish and irrational and is dangerous for our economy, and I would argue that, but it doesn't make it any less of a reality. John in Derby, hello.
I am.
What's your end game?
Stopping Brexit would be quite nice, to be honest.
Okay.
Yeah, the long and short of it, my position is, as UK constitutional law says, we do not have to follow the referendum. It's a non-binding referendum. Parliament is beholden to the will of the people, not the vote, which is going to be 3 years old by the time we get to Brexit. And and as recent polls have shown us, and as polls throughout the whole of this year have shown us, the majority no longer want to leave, and the majority want to remain in the EU.
Well, which polls? I mean, the most latest, the most latest, is that a word? The most recent has pointed in the direction of a little flicker for Remain again, but there've been plenty that don't.
I've been tracking through through most of this year, actually, and pretty much everything that asks the question, do you want to leave or remain, has come up with the majority want to remain. There have been some there were some on YouGov with that Relievers stat where it asked quite a flawed question, actually, with questions like the duty and kind of moralistic questions about whether we should be leaving and respecting the referendum or ignoring it, which is kind of the textbook example of a loaded question, to be honest. And I haven't found a single one where it's kind of completely clear down the line and said the majority still want to leave in about a year and 3 months now.
To be honest, as for whether it was binding or not, David Cameron, it seems to me David Cameron just presented it as a binding referendum, and therefore it isn't. But I think whether technically it is or it isn't, and I'm sure there are lawyers that could argue either way, it just is now. Politically it's binding. And I can't. There is no politician that will backtrack on that.
Well, Chuka Romano probably would. Well,
the overt Remainers who want it not to happen and are bold enough to say so. Yes, you're right. They would, but
and to be honest,
politically, it's binding.
It will be politically impossible to pass which would cause quite significant damage to the country in about a year and a half time. Well, next springtime, without having the permission of the public, because there are quite a lot of people like me who would not accept a Brexit that would damage the country and would be pretty strongly opposed to any party who had enacted that, and a lot of those are Tory voters as well. So I can't see the current Conservative government doing something that will cause such damage to the country and expecting to get elected again unless they consult the country.
But you'd have to know that, you'd have to prove that damage, wouldn't you? And I wonder whether you can in time, whether actually it will take time to see how damaging Brexit is or not.
I can't do it over a radio thing, but there's been quite a few studies that have shown the UK growth has stalled with one of the slowest growing economies in Europe when I believe
still growing, but more slowly, yeah.
Yeah, we would probably have grown an extra 1%, which is many, many billions, which would make the number on the bus look tiny, to be honest. Had we not left, we would be in a much better financial situation. The pound would be better.
But do you agree with me, John, that for many people, it's emotional first, financial second?
Some of the worst choices that people make are emotional. I think that it is emotional.
Some of the best choices that people make are emotional.
Often they're backed up with, but I'll grant you that. But I think in this case,
ever been in love, John?
Yeah.
Well, the same is true either way, isn't it? It can be disastrous or fantastic. Yeah.
I think to be honest, facts and studies and like the sort of things that the people who say it's really simple really don't want to read are what we should be basing policy on, not emotion.
And what do you make of what the IPPR is saying here, this attempt at a compromise? I mean, I think there's elegance in it, but I think it completely turns a blind eye to the emotion factor, which is politics.
It's impossible to fulfill the emotional factor, though. This is kind of them trying to make a compromise with someone who's not willing to compromise, and I think there's people not willing to compromise on both sides, to be honest. So it's just highlighting how much of an omnishambles Brexit is, to be honest. It's not going to be, no one's going to be happy with it. No one's going to really benefit from it except for the disaster capitalists, and it's going to be a total. It's going to be something we're going to look back on 20 years and just ask what the heck were we thinking. All
right, John. Thank you, John in Derby. Mark has called from Braintree. Hi, Mark.
Oh, hello there. Thanks for taking my call.
Fire away, Mark.
I just want to make my point, really. I did vote to leave the EU, and the reason for that is because it's that the city of size of the size of Newcastle coming to the UK every year is simply unsustainable. People are coming, they're working, and they're doing a fantastic job, but the taxes they're paying simply do not put into the system what they're taking out. We have their children to school, we have the NHS to pay for them, we have police, we have ambulance.
But you do know that a lot of they that you're talking about do work and pay taxes and contribute.
Yeah, of course they do, but they're paying taxes, but they're taking more out than what they're putting in, a lot of these Europeans, and that's the issue.
So are a lot of so are a lot of British people. For example, wealthier people pay bigger chunks of income tax, for example, and corporation tax. And there are, thankfully, poorer people taken out of the tax system altogether or given a higher threshold before they are taxed. I probably, as a taxpayer, pay more into the NHS than I even conceivably take out of it, thank goodness, because largely I'm healthy.
Absolutely.
But in the future, I will. And I'm doing it now for other people so that in the future, I'm other people.
The problem we do not have the infrastructure to accommodate the city the size of Newcastle every year for an indefinite period of time. That's the issue. If we sustain that for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years, it's not sustainable.
So for you, it's freedom of movement. That's what has to go.
It's got to. I can't see another answer to the problem. People are waiting 6-7 hours for an ambulance at the moment. It's demand and supply.
I thought it was you make some good points, Mark. I thought it was interesting on Friday. Was it Friday? Yes, Friday, when Donald Tusk and Jean-Claude Juncker made that statement. This was at the European Council in Brussels, and Donald Tusk in particular, before even touching on Brexit, he talked about those mandatory quotas for EU member states and the debate around who should take what number of migrants, because there are still huge numbers of people shifting from the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa, and that has to be addressed by the world, not just by the EU, by the world.
But the issue is, it's not just about migrants. Of course we should take our quota, and I've no issue with that. But when you have Eastern European countries that would love to come to Western Europe because it's a better life, and anybody would want to do that, absolutely. But it's just an imbalance. It's called free movement, but unfortunately, the majority of people are coming to the UK or to Western Europe, and not many people are leaving. So it's simply, in my view, unsustainable the way we are at the moment. 9 hours wait for an ambulance. Schools are at their highest. The infrastructure isn't there.
And that's not just the fault of or the core. asylum seeking and migrant arrivals isn't the only pressure on those services, Mark. I think you'd agree with that. I think you'd agree that a decade of austerity has its part to play, which has probably altered a lot of people's views of migrants, because it's so much easier to say those foreigners over there are making it difficult for me, when in fact, in part at least, it's got to be your own governments making it difficult for you, or the economic circumstances that we all find ourselves in. Mark, thank you for your call. Mark in Braintree. More of your calls in a moment, and your texts and tweets as well. Joe's call from Croydon and Andrew in Oxford. What's your Brexit endgame, Joe?
Hello, Sheila. Thanks for taking my call.
Pleasure.
Well, basically, it was a bit of response to what Mark said, essentially, the guy you had on last. I just wanted to talk about Polish people and Eastern Europeans especially. My wife is Polish. She came to the country 14 years ago with £100 in her pocket, never claimed a day's benefits in her life, got a job as a cleaner, ended up getting a job as a receptionist, then as a manageress, then as a manager of a hotel, then as a manager of a cinema, and now she's a police officer. And she's never claimed a day's benefits, and she's never not had a day off work, and she's not taken anything out of this country. In fact, she's only paid taxes for the entire time that she's been here.
And it's so easy. It's so easy for people to say migrant equals problem. And some migrants will equal problem and will have problems, but many more, the vast majority, are doing what your wife did.
Absolutely. And then if you go back even further, my grandparents are from Eastern Europe as well, funnily enough. It's quite funny that I end up marrying a Polish lady. But they...
Genetic memory, Joe.
Yeah, there you go.
We can do an hour on that another time, yeah.
But, so they settled in East London before the Second World War, and my grandfather ended up, who was Lithuanian, ended up being... fighting in the British Army, in the Royal Artillery in the Second World War. Never took a day's money out of the country, only paid taxes all of his life, and then ended up as a Chelsea pensioner, and he was an immigrant. So, there you go. And Brexit, I'm against it. I think we should stay in.
So your end game is that the whole thing never happens?
I think it's crazy. I think we've been sold, if I'm honest about it, we've been sold an emotional xenophobic lie about leaving Europe. And I think it's very, very, it's a very, very old mindset that we're now embarking upon, and I think it's a big mistake.
Okay, thanks very much, Joe, for your call. Joe in Croydon. Mary's call from Upminster. What's your end game, Mary?
Oh, hi, Sheila. I've just got out of work, got in the car, and I had to phone. I listened to that fella banging on again about immigrants, and it just makes my blood boil. I voted to remain. I don't particularly like everything about the EU. But you can't do a lot when you're not in it. You can't do a lot to change it when you're not a part of it. If only people would learn from their history. My mother came over from Southern Ireland. People will now say to me, that doesn't count. But it does. She was an immigrant. She used to have to put up with no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. And as I said to your researcher, she was more upset that the dogs came before the Irish. She did, her and her two sisters did work that no one else wanted to do. It's very similar to what you see now with Eastern European people doing hospitality jobs.
When did she come over? Because my parents both came over in the late 50s from the south of Ireland.
No, she would have been 95 now, my mother had.
So a lot earlier.
19, a lot earlier. But she embraced this country. She married an Englishman. She had 3 children. He paid a lot of taxes, my father, my late father. She had 3 children who we all paid our taxes. Grandchildren who've gone on to university who will be paying a hell of a lot of taxes. If only they could see the bigger picture. I just wish the bankers are probably laughing at this because it's pushing all the responsibility of what they did off their shoulders and sticking it on to the poor migrants. And I just think, if my mother hadn't had the confidence to come over as a 19-year-old girl doing horrible little jobs, she was a barmaid, she was a nanny, and I use that in a very euphemistic way. It wasn't as a nanny in today's terms. She was like a general dog's body.
Yeah.
But if only they could see the bigger picture, that it isn't the immigrants' fault. This all started. That fella saying, oh, there's no place in schools. Why? Because the government are slashing the amount of money they're putting into schools.
And failing to train enough teachers. And teachers are leaving in droves. And schools are having to do something about it. Mary, thank you for your call. Mary in Upminster. Andrew in Oxford. Hello.
Hello. Just a quick couple of things. Your caller a few calls ago, I work for the ambulance service for my sins. And the fact that it takes 8 or 9 hours to an ambulance to get to you isn't down to immigrants, it's down to people using the ambulance service for the wrong reasons. But that's another long subject anyway. I believe no deal is better than any deal it looks like at the moment.
Say that again, Andrew.
I believe any no deal is better than any deal we're getting at the moment.
Because?
I just think the EU will come to us when we say we've got no deal because they import to us more than we export to them. And they've got German car manufacturing, you've got the French wine, you've got the Spanish oil industries. I think if they tariff against us, we'll just tariff against them. And I reckon we will get a better deal than we will at the moment.
So we need to play hardball, is what you're saying?
Pretty much, yes.
All right, Andrew, thank you. Andrew in Oxford. Yusuf in Guildford, hello.
Oh, hello.
Hello.
Oh, hi, Sheila. I am the son of, both my parents came from Austria, and I voted for Brexit on 29. I think a Canada plus, as David Davis has said, is the best deal.
And why is that?
I don't think that many people, certainly not people I know, voted due to immigration. It's sovereignty, and trade with a Canada plus deal would allow us to retain a lot of the advantages we have. And the EU already has, I think it's 6 different trade models, but says we're not allowed to cherry pick, which I find a little hypocritical.
Why?
Well, don't you?
Well, what do you find hypocritical particularly?
Well, we're not allowed to cherry pick, but the EU has done bespoke deals for 6 different places.
But we are a member leaving. It's different, isn't it? It's more deeply political than the EU doing a deal with Canada, because it seems to me anyway, because of that reason.
No, I do agree with that, but at the same time, our markets are more deeply intertwined, and our political system and regulations. So a bespoke deal, despite Michel Barnier's whatever his statement was, seems foolish.
And your preference would be what? Just hard Brexit, if that's what it takes? Just leave?
No, my preference would be a trade.
The Canada, you said at the beginning, sorry, apologies, you said that at the beginning, Canada plus.
But if it does come to no deal, then I don't really want to see that. I think migration is important for this country. I wouldn't be here without migration. I think there are many advantages that the EU does offer, and that having a deal that retains some of those is best for the country.
Okay, thank you, Yusuf. Yusuf in Guildford. Dave in Hounslow, what's your end game?
Yeah, hi Sheila. What I was going to say was a lot of people don't know the difference between an MP and an MEP. The difference is that one's an elected Democrat, the other one's a faceless bureaucrat. Do we want to be governed by...
But they are elected. MEPs are elected.
They're not elected by the people. They might be selected by certain politicians, and they're lobbied by vested interests and corporations, but they're not elected by the people.
Well, I've elected my MEPs over the years.
No, MEPs are not elected by... MEPs haven't got any power, first of all. MPs are directly elected by the people. How many people actually know who their MEPs are?
You're right, not many, yeah.
Yeah. So they have virtually zero contact with the people that are supposed to be elected by them. They claim to be democratic, but they're not. They're not. You know, they're faceless bureaucrats at the end of the day. The other thing is, all laws are shaped by democratic systems. If you remove that, you won't have it. It won't be a democracy.
So how do you feel about Parliament's battle to be involved in the end game by having its vote?
Well, the thing is, parliamentary sovereignty, without the public, there is no parliament. The sovereignty of the electorate transcends that of parliamentary sovereignty. So,
but no, hang on. But you spent the first half of this conversation talking about the validity of Parliament, which is why I asked you the question about Parliament's role in the end game of Brexit. Are you comfortable with them having the vote that they're seeking?
Well, depends on what the vote is.
Okay. You might find that if they disagree with you, you're uncomfortable with parliamentary sovereignty.
I'm a bit confused.
What I'm saying is, you began by saying MPs, proper elected representatives, Parliament full of MPs, and I'm because you are clearly in favour of that form of democracy, and I think rightly so. I'm asking you whether you are happy for those MPs, elected representatives of you and me and everybody else, to have a vote at the end on Brexit.
I think they should actually allow the referendum to take its. It hasn't been exercised properly. So, if any vote that they have is going to be, it was engineered by the people that were opposed to Brexit anyway. So it's basically an eroded process. It's not.
Is that a long-winded way of saying no thanks? Could Parliament butt out on that one?
No. What I'm saying is that at the end of the day, if democracy was to allow to progress the way the referendum was supposed to let it go through, we wouldn't be having this vote. We would actually be processing a way of leaving the EU.
But democracy is a vibrant, dynamic thing. It didn't end on June the 23rd, 2016. There are still questions, there are still debates, there are still fights to be had. Why not? That's what parliamentary democracy is all about.
No, I think the way democracy is going at the moment is being chipped away every single day. It's the people in the powers that be hate everything about democracy because the powers that be are, at the end of the day, they're unelected. You don't see these faceless.
Well, okay. Well, the MPs are elected, and you began by being very happy about that, but ended by not being so happy about it. If they dare to disagree with you, Dave, thank you very much indeed for your call, Dave, in Hounslow.